begin with the crisis in Syria and U.S. President Obama's latest challenge to his critics. Speaking in Stockholm, Sweden, Mr. Obama says the international community's credibility is at stake if Syria's alleged chemical attacks on its people are not addressed. The president did not set a red line, but he says that the line was set when world powers approved a treaty against the use of chemical weapons.
My credibility is not on the line. The international community's credibility is on the line. And America and Congress's credibility is on the line because we give lip service to the notion that these international norms are important. And so the question is, how credible is the international community when it says this is an international norm that has to be observed? The question is, how credible is Congress when it passes a treaty saying we have to forbid the use of chemical weapons?
Well, Mr. Obama says he and Sweden's Prime Minister agreed that the international community cannot be silent in the face of, quote, the barbarism in Syria. They said that a failure to act would increase the possibility of further attacks. Mr. Obama was in Stockholm before flying on to Russia for the G20 summit in St. Petersburg, where Syria is expected to be high on the agenda. VOA's Zlata Hoke here has more on that story.
Before leaving for his three-day trip Tuesday evening, President Obama secured support for military action against Syria from top congressional leaders and expressed confidence that Congress will pass his resolution authorizing a strike against Damascus. But President Obama also wants international support for such an operation. French President François Hollande already has promised his support. On Tuesday, he expressed hope that a broader consensus can be reached at the G20 summit in St. Petersburg, Russia.
When a chemical massacre happens, when the world knows about it, when the evidence is provided, when the perpetrators are known to us, there has to be a response. The international community expects this response. And coming together, German president, French president, we express the same indignation, the same condemnation, and at the same time the same hope that a political solution will be found for Syria.
President Hollande spoke to reporters after meeting with the German president Joachim GAUCK in Paris.
Angela Merkel considers that during the upcoming meetings, for example at the G20, that it will be possible to come to an international agreement about the appropriate response in regard to Syria.
United Nations Chief Ban Ki-moon also will attend the summit in Russia's second-largest city. He has warned against any military action in Syria before a UN team reports the results of its investigation conducted in a suburb of Damascus, where Syrian forces allegedly used chemical weapons August 21. Before heading for the summit, Mr. Ban also stressed that the use of such weapons would constitute a grave violation of international laws.
We must put an end to the atrocities the Syrian people continue to suffer. We should avoid further militarization of the conflict and revitalize the search for a political settlement. I take note of the argument for action to prevent future uses of chemical weapons. At the same time, we must consider the impact of any punitive measure on efforts to prevent the further bloodshed and facilitate the political resolution of the conflict.
Syria has denied using chemical weapons, and its ally Russia, the summit's host, is expected to try to dissuade participants from joining a coalition for a strike on Syria. While in Russia, President Obama also is expected to meet a group of rights activists to discuss the country's controversial laws that critics say clamp down on freedoms and repress minorities, such as the opposition and gay and lesbian communities. Zlarica Hoke, VOA News, Washington.
President Obama's stern words come as his administration intensifies pressure on U.S. lawmakers to authorize the use of force in Syria. We continue our coverage with VOA's Michael Bowman on Capitol Hill.
What happened in Syria is an example of the horror of chemical weapons, according to U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry.
It did happen, and the Assad regime did it.
Kerry warned a Senate panel against not acting.
If you're Assad, or if you're any one of the other despots in that region, and the United States steps back from this moment, together with our other allies and friends, what is the message? The message is that he has been granted impunity.
No more war in Syria!
Protesters against U.S. intervention interrupted the hearing. Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Robert Menendez said Americans are war-weary, but added,
We will either send a message to Syria, Iran, North Korea, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and any other non-state actors that the world will not tolerate the senseless use of chemical weapons by anyone, or we will choose to stand silent in the face of horrific human suffering.
Some senators want strict limits on U.S. military actions in Syria. Republican Bob Corker.
I don't think there are any of us here that are willing to support the possibility of having combat boots on the ground.
Kerry said there would be no U.S. ground forces intervening in Syria's civil war. Other lawmakers questioned what a limited military operation will accomplish. Republican Senator James Risch suggested a troubling scenario.
If we go in with a limited strike, and the day after, or the week after, or the month after, Assad crawls out of his rat hole and says, look, I stood up to the strongest power on the face of this earth, and I won.
Kerry argued there is no way that U.S. strikes would strengthen the Syrian president. Earlier Tuesday, President Barack Obama sought to draw a distinction between the use of force in Syria and the long, open-ended campaigns of America's recent past.
This is not Iraq, and this is not Afghanistan. This is a limited, proportional step that will send a clear message.
Key congressional leaders emerged from a White House meeting voicing support. House Speaker John Boehner.
I'm going to support the president's call for action. I believe that my colleagues should support this call for action. We have enemies around the world that need to understand that we're not going to tolerate this type of behavior.
House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi also promised a yes vote, but added,
I believe that the American people need to hear more about the intelligence that supports this action.
Congressional votes on the use of force in Syria are expected early next week. Michael Bowman, VOA News, the Capitol.
Americans have grown extremely weary after more than a decade of war. Strong memories of the faulty intelligence that led to the invasion of Iraq remain vivid to many, and skepticism appears to be growing about the proposed military attack on Syria. Polls show a majority of Americans are firmly opposed to such a move. Here is VOA's Meredith Buell.
It was called shock and awe. The application of massive military force designed to overwhelm the Iraqi military in 2003. Necessary U.S. officials said because of concern about weapons of mass destruction and a desire to end the conflict quickly. But it took until the final days of 2011 before the last American troops left Iraq, where an insurgency continues to rage. The war in Afghanistan has lasted even longer, and American troops continue to fight the Taliban. And now in Syria, with hundreds dead from apparent chemical weapons, America is considering another attack in the Middle East. But surveys show many Americans oppose such a move. David Schenker of the Washington Institute.
We're war weary. We've gone through Iraq, we've gone through Afghanistan, we spent blood and treasure. Most people in the United States want to focus on rebuilding the economy here and not get entangled in a foreign embroilment.
Recent polls show about 60% of Americans oppose a U.S. military strike on Syria, while just 9% support it. Quinnipiac University pollster Peter Brown.
Early in Syria, they're very much set against, that is, voters are very much set against the notion of U.S. troops there or any U.S. aid except for weapons that would not endanger any American lives, such as perhaps like a cruise missile or a drone strike.
There is stiff opposition from close allies like Britain. Via Skype, James Boyes of London's King's College.
There seems to be a sudden rush to war, a rush to use military hardware against the Assad regime. There doesn't appear to be any obvious justification as to why this may be.
Just before the start of the Iraq War, then Secretary of State Colin Powell made a detailed presentation to the UN Security Council. But the intelligence about Iraq's weapons programs turned out to be wrong. Brian Bender of the Boston Globe newspaper.
In the wake of the Iraq War, where weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, possibly nuclear weapons were the rationale for the war, and it turned out that Saddam Hussein did not have them, I think that there's going to be a lot of skepticism in the United States, but also abroad.
Obama, hands off Syria!
So years of war and skepticism about intelligence are casting a long shadow over decisions by the White House regarding the civil war in Syria. Meredith Buell, VOA News, Washington.